What's up, humans, and welcome to a new Psicoactivo. Happy Tuesday, everybody. I hope everybody's doing okay. Today, I got a really special treat for everybody because this is a person, my next guest, who I've been looking at and enjoying a lot of his conversations in different platforms and his work, more importantly, because he's a best-selling author. He received a computer science and engineering degree from MIT, and he has an MS in management from Stanford Graduate School of Business. He's most known in the UFO world for the most recent book that he wrote, which is called The Simulation Hypothesis. And I'm very excited to talk to Mr. Rizwan Virk on the show. Welcome, Mr. Riz. How you doing?
Hi, thanks for having me on your show. I'm doing well, thanks.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you, but if you can give people a little, just a small summary of who you are and what got you interested into the UFO topic in general, because I know you have a different trajectory, which we're going to get into, but just a little summation, please.
Yeah, so, my background is in computer science, and then I became an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley, and then a venture capital and angel investor. And so, my interest in consciousness goes back a long way. Even when I was running startups, I used to joke that I lived a double life. Like during the day, I'd be dealing with investors and employees, engineers, and Fortune 500 companies, and then in the evening, I would go off to try some consciousness technique, like trying to see auras, or going off to the Monroe Institute in for out-of-body experiences, or shamanic drumming, or other types of things. And so, I got interested in UFOs in particular, more when I became involved in a film called Thrive. What on Earth Will It Take? Now, I was in Mountain View, California, which is the home of Google. It's also the home of SETI, which is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which started off as this kind of field within science that was looked askance upon. People said, "Oh, that's not legitimate. What are you doing looking for little green aliens?" Now, of course, they've now become to the point where they talk about UFOs in the same way that the rest of the scientific community used to talk about them. So it's funny how that works. But I wrote an article about the conference and my interest in UFOs, and I felt like the most interesting person at the conference wasn't any of the scientists who were like, "No, aliens couldn't be here. We're just looking for signals." It was actually a Star Trek actor who was on Star Trek Voyager. And I haven't really told this story before, so I'll go into a little more detail here. But and he said, "Well, we're sitting here looking for smoke signals across the Atlantic. There may be other science and other things that we don't know about." And he didn't even get to the point of saying that the UFOs were aliens or not, but he at least said he was more open-minded than the actual scientists were about it. So I wrote an article about this, and then there was a guy named Foster Gamble. I don't know if you've ever heard of him.
No, I haven't.
He made a film called Thrive, What on Earth Will It Take? And he's a direct descendant of one of the founders of Procter and Gamble, which is a very big, U.S. Fortune 500 company. And so he's part of that family, and they're kind of well known, like in the Bay Area. There's the Gamble house, was like his aunt's house, and now it's like a public thing people can go. So he comes from this wealthy family, but this film was more of a conspiracy film than anything. And he has had a lifelong quest looking for free energy devices and how these things work using geometry. And the film became quite popular. It's probably one of the most watched free documentaries of all time. It's on YouTube. But at Occupy Wall Street back in like 2011, I don't know if you remember that movie.
Yeah, I do.
They would like screen Thrive up on the walls back in the day. But there was an element of that film which touched on UFOs. And so I had written an article about my attending the SETI conference and my interest in UFOs. And he reached out to me, and I ended up getting involved because he said I was one of the few guys who was interested in both, the scientific side of things and the UFO kind of community and reports side of things. And so that got me involved in that film. And then I started to go to these UFO conferences. Like there used to be, one of the biggest ones was the International UFO Congress in Phoenix, which is actually where I am now. I'm in Arizona. But back in 2012, and I started to meet people who were usually people that were pretty well known within the UFO community, but weren't necessarily that known outside of it. And then over time, I started to meet many of the major figures at the time, and I started listening to reports from people. And these reports got me more and more convinced that there's something really strange going on here that hasn't been explained. And then I met Jacques Vallée in Silicon Valley, and I got to know him. He's actually a computer scientist by background. I mean, most of the whole world know him because he was part of Project Blue Book, and he was the inspiration for the French scientist in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. But I got to know him, because we were both in Silicon Valley and interested in these subjects. And so this is kind of a long answer.
No, don't worry. I love this.
In parallel with this particular search, where I would meet people and they would tell me about their sightings. And, I was in the video game industry, and I became an entrepreneur in the video game industry. We had the #1 game on the App Store for mobile phones back in 2011. We sold the company, and then I became an investor and advisor to different startups. And it wasn't until 2016 that I had sold my last video game company, and I said, okay, I'm done with running companies. That's a lot of work. And I went and visited a company that had a virtual reality game, and they were actually partners of ours. And so they said, hey, you got to try this out. So I started to play this, put the headset on my face. And back then the VR headsets were pretty big.
Yeah.
We used to call them a toaster on your face. That's how big they were. And so I started to play the ping pong game, and it was so responsive that I had to hold it just where I would really hold it, and it felt like I was hitting a real ball across to the opponent. The graphics were terrible, the thing was uncomfortable, but the responsiveness and the physics engine was so good that it convinced me for a second. It convinced my body that I was playing a real game of table tennis. So much so that I tried to put the paddle down on the table, and I tried to lean against the table. But of course, there was no table. It was just all in virtual reality. And so at that point, I started to think about what would it take for us to build something that was so immersive that it would seem to us we were in a real world place playing a real world game, something like The Matrix. And we would forget, not just for a minute or a second, which is what happened to me. It was really just a couple of seconds that my body forgot about it, but we would forget for long periods of time. And so that got me thinking about the future of AI, video games, virtual reality, augmented reality, all this stuff. And then I started to get into this idea of, well, perhaps we're already inside a video game. And I found that it brought together this idea that we were inside a video game, brought together my interest in consciousness, my interest in unexplained phenomena like UFOs, but also my interest in technology, and then my interest in science, because I found that quantum mechanics was telling us something similar, that this isn't a physical reality, that everything we think is physical actually isn't. It just consists of information. And then when I looked at the religious traditions, including the one that I grew up with, which was Islam, and of course I grew up in the US, so Christianity was the dominant religion here, as well as Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, like they were all telling us that this world is a kind of hoax. And so I found that the simulation hypothesis is a way to bring all of these together, of all the areas that I've been interested in pretty much all my life. And so that's how I ended up writing the first edition of this book back in 2019. But the new edition, which literally just came out in this summer, is the one that people have heard me talking on podcasts recently. It's with the latest hardcover book. And I self-published the book originally because no publisher, thought there was a market for this kind of thing. And that's what I was going to say as a summary of how I got into this and where I am today.
I wanted to ask you, though, about the ancient texts, because you've spoken about how the ancient texts do explain the simulation hypothesis. You were specifically talking about which type of religious text, and what do you mean by that when you said that?
Well, what I found was it wasn't just one, but I started off by having the subtitle of this book is an MIT computer scientist shows why AI, quantum physics, and Eastern mystics agree that we are in a video game. And so I started off with the Eastern mystics, the yogis, the Buddhists, and the Hindus, because in that tradition, it's kind of a key cornerstone of at least a mystical part of that path, that the world is Maya, or an illusion, is the translation of the term Maya. And in fact, the term Buddha often gets translated to as awake. And so, he basically says when he became enlightened, he became awake, which means before that he was asleep like the rest of us, and we're all dreaming. And so this idea of Maya being an illusion, I looked into it even more, and it turns out its definition is closer to like a carefully crafted illusion, meaning like when we go to a magic show. Okay, we go to a magic show, and we know that guy is not really sawing that woman in half, but it looks like he is. And that's the fun, quote unquote, fun of it, or horror of it, right? It looks like he's sawing this woman in half. And so it's almost like a carefully crafted illusion that we ourselves agree to be a part of, right? And then within those traditions, there's this idea of multiple lives, and they use a metaphor. And one of the metaphors they use directly in the Bhagavad Gita is that the soul, which they call the Atman, puts on the body, and then at death, it takes off, gets out of the body, and it takes it on and off as if it was a pair of clothes. So it's like you're setting aside your clothes, and now you're going on and putting on a different outfit. And that's how it describes multiple lives and reincarnation. And so I found this intriguing that it's using these metaphors, right? Whether it's the dream, or there's a term in Sanskrit called the lila. And lila literally means the play or a game of the gods. And so when a divine entity comes in, it's like they're playing. That's why they're here. And, that of course ties to the idea that we ourselves might be in a game. So I started with those traditions. And in fact, if you've ever seen the game in the West, it's called Chutes and Ladders. And that game is from India. And it was originally called Snakes and Ladders. And if you look at the original game, it's called the Gyam Chopar. And what it meant was the game of life. And literally, every square was like you coming back to a life, and every time you hit a snake, it was like karma. You were creating karma, and it was dragging you down. If you got up to the top, you were kind of reaching that enlightened state. And they even called it the lila, which is the same term that was used by the spiritual traditions. So I looked at this and I realized, okay, they have to speak in metaphors to try to tell us what the nature of the universe is. And then I found that exact same metaphor being used in the Sufi traditions, particularly with Rumi. So Rumi has become one of the most popular poets in the West anyway, but he was actually a Sufi Islamic mystic. And there were other mystics like him as well, who have this beautiful poetry that tries to describe the path to God. But he basically said that when the soul dies, it basically takes off from the body as if it was taking off a set of garments or clothes. And I looked at that and I said, oh, look, it's the exact same metaphor. Now, obviously, they don't mean it's an actual set of clothes, like in a closet where your bodies are lying in the closet. No, they're using it to explain a process that is perhaps ineffable. Ineffable means it's unable to be put in words.
Yeah.
And so, all the scriptures, basically most of these traditions, they come about because there's a mystic at the beginning, at least one. Sometimes with Hinduism, there's many mystics. They're called the rishis, right? But whether Islam or whether it's, Jesus going to the desert, or it's Moses communicating with God, whatever, religion there is, typically tends to start with one or more mystics. And what happens is one of two things happen. One is what religious scholars call a theophany. And a theophany is when something divine breaks its way into the physical world, and then they have to pay attention because, holy shit, what's going on? There's something divine. Now you can think of that as like, Moses passes a burning bush and it starts talking to him, and he's like, what the heck is going on here? It could be like an angel appears. or they're involved in yogic techniques or other types of consciousness expanding techniques, breath work, or they're fasting, or they're doing psychedelics or different types of techniques. And when they do, then they start to observe a larger reality beyond the physical. And that's the one thing that pretty much all the religions share, except atheism, which isn't really a religion, but I call it a religion because they tend to be very fundamentalist in their point of view.
Yeah, they are. I used to be one, but then I had an NDE, and I don't know anymore. I
Yeah.
seem to have had some sort of contact with something that I can't understand.
Yeah.
So
And NDEs were one of the things that convinced me. Let's talk more about that in a minute. But so what happens is that these mystics then have to come back and they have to describe to people what they saw. And there's no way to describe it except you have to use words and techniques and things that people are familiar with. So they'll use metaphors, but often they'll use technological metaphors. They'll use the idea of a book or a gate, the pearly gates of heaven, right? Those aren't meant to be actual gates. And so I found this to be the case, with angels as well. So that's a quick overview of kind of my journey down, and I can get more specific with some of those metaphors if you like.
it's funny that when I asked you about UFOs, you initially told me you studied consciousness, and coincidentally, that when I started the podcast, I wanted to talk about consciousness and psychedelic experiences, but then I realized that UFOs were like intimately linked to consciousness, and it was funny just how you responded to me about that first.
Well, it's funny because I was doing different aspects of consciousness as practices and experiments and studies, and then I got involved in the UFO phenomenon, and I thought, oh, okay, this one is nuts and bolts. This one is much easier to like put your get your head around. And then unfortunately, the deeper you go into it, the more you realize, oh my gosh, it's actually deeply connected with these other things.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you though about how the paranormal you think fits into your simulation hypothesis, because it's not just UFOs. I mean, there's that Skinwalker Ranch place, and then there's Mel's Hole, and then here in Mexico we have a place called the Zone of Silence, and
what of silence?
The zone of silence.
Zone of silence. Okay.
Yeah, and it's close to Sonora, and it's like a desert place, but even the vibe feels different there, and there's like electromagnetic anomalies everywhere, and people see stuff. And how do you think that fits into your simulation hypothesis? Because there seems to be a lot going on. It's not just UFOs.
Yeah.
And how do you explain the paranormal with your frame?
Well, so there's a lot of different aspects of the paranormal, and you can also tie in things like telepathy and remote viewing and out-of-body experiences, in addition to seeing strange beings or ghosts or other types of things. And so the model that I like to use in simulation theory. So before we get into that, it's worth explaining there's two different flavors of simulation theory, at least two different flavors. One of which is called the NPC version, where everyone is a non-player character, which means we're all AI running on somebody's computer. That's what a lot of academics talk about when they're talking about the simulation hypothesis. The other version is what I call the RPG version, or the role-playing game version. And in this version, the simulation is more like a video game, an immersive one. It's more like the Matrix. So in the Matrix, Neo and Morpheus and Trinity, they all existed outside of the simulation. And then they had a character inside the game that was called their avatar, right? And those two extremes, those two flavors are not mutually exclusive. You also had in the Matrix Agent Smith and the Oracle. These were all programs, so they were AI programs. But you had a lot of real characters who were avatars of real people. And so that is the model, particularly when I'm talking about the paranormal, that I prefer because it opens up a new way to think about things, including synchronicity, et cetera, that could not be explained And that's why we call it the paranormal, right? Because it's not something most people either normally see or something that modern science can't explain because they don't have a framework for it. But if your framework is that this is a computer-generated reality, almost like a kind of hologram, if you will, and that each of us is playing the game where, okay, somewhere outside of this world that we think is a physical world, and we may each have our own computers, if you think of it that way, right? For example, you and I, we are not really talking to each other right now. It might seem like we are, but we aren't. Right? I'm talking to my computer, and the bits are being sent over the internet to your computer, and your computer is creating the sounds, and then you're talking back to your computer. And the same is true when the two of us, if the two of us were playing World of Warcraft or Fortnite, and we're shooting at each other. Okay, it might look like we're in the same space, but we're really not. I'm sitting, in my home, and you're sitting in your home. And what if that's true even in our so-called physical reality? When we're meeting people and we're interacting with them physically, we're actually both, rendering that is how I like to refer to it. Just like in a video game, you render it on your local computer. There's no shared rendering, meaning that it's not like one set of pixels that everybody is looking at. It's actually information on a server that gets rendered on each device, depending on where you are. And so you only have to render the parts of the world that are relevant to you. Just like I can see you, but I can't see what's outside your house. Right. Yeah. Similarly here, you don't need to see, Phoenix, Arizona, outside of my office here where I'm speaking. And so if you use that model, then that opens up a whole host of things that might seem unexplainable at first. So for example, telepathy, right? Telepathy in a game, not only do you see each other, let's say, quote unquote, physically within the game, the virtual game, but there are all these other things. There's all this other information on the screen that I can see, but you can't see it. And similarly, with other characters, they can see their stuff. And there's usually like a friends list, right? And you can send private messages back and forth. But those are not necessarily spoken in the actual game world itself. So we start to see a different model of telepathy. And you can also change what's called a virtual camera. So right now, most of us are fixed in a first person point of view. Like, okay, I'm kind of fixed here. I'm looking out. I'm not seeing everything, that's outside in Phoenix yet either, right? I'm just seeing the things where my physical body, where my avatar is. But it's possible to have a camera, and you can shift the camera so that I'm looking from up here, which is what a lot of games do. So if you look at some videos of, some of these 3D MMORPG games, you'll see that the character is running along, and he's viewing it right from like back here.
Like the open world ones, right?
Yeah, like all the open world ones, right? But turns out that's just another fixed position. You can also change it. If you can get access to code, you can change it to look at any place inside the 3D world. You can set XYZ coordinates. So now we have a way to explain not just telepathy, but also remote viewing, right? So when you're sitting there, how did they do remote viewing? They would write down some coordinates, right? Now, in our case, it's latitude and longitude, but really in any 3D world, you can think of it as sort of an XYZ coordinates. And then, it's almost like they have to relax to loosen the virtual camera. And now they can put the virtual camera anywhere else throughout. So those are a couple of examples. Now, if you've seen the telepathy tapes, or heard of the telepathy tapes podcast,
I've spoken to Kai and Dr. Powell and Dr. Julia Mosbridge here. They're wonderful.
Okay. Yeah, they're great. So what happened was I actually met Dr. Powell a few years ago, like before the telepathy tapes came out, and she reached out to me, and she said she was doing research on these autistic savants who seemed to have psychic abilities. And she said that the only explanation or model she could come up with for this type of thing was that we are in a simulated world that's built of information, because they're able to get that information from somewhere else outside of it. So she invited me to talk at an actual symposium that she did on simulation hypothesis and savant syndrome. And that's where I really began to think about that. And then, of course, a couple of years later, the telepathy tapes came out, and now everybody knows about her research. But it's interesting to me that she settled on a model that's very similar to my video game model as a way to explain that. And then I don't know if you're familiar with Dahlia Bergeron and her.
Yes, I am.
Daughter
She does the mindset stuff. Yeah.
She does mindset, and then her daughter is also one of these autistic kids who's also psychic, and so they've done demonstrations with each other where Lidu will say what Dahlia is looking at, even though she's over there and she can't see it because of that mother-daughter connection. And so they told me, we were at a conference recently together in San Diego, actually, not too far from you. And her mom told me that Lidu, the autistic daughter, had told her that it's kind of like a video game. That's why she's able to get this information. And I like to explain it as, well, for the rest of us, we're kind of locked into our body. It's almost like we have a virtual reality headset and that full body suit, which is why we have full control over things like our fingers. We can have fine motor controls. But some of these autistic kids, they don't have that level of control over, over their vocal cords, over their fingers, but they have some level of control. It's at a grosser level. It's almost like they're sitting there with a mouse trying to control their character.
But they have access to other abilities, right? Because of those
they're not locked into that first person point of view. So they can kind of look around and see what else is going on. Look at the other information. Whereas the rest of us, we're like inside the suit so heavily that we can't. Now that's just a metaphor. That doesn't mean that it's an actual physical reality suit. But it's a simulation. So those are some of the ways in which I think the paranormal and psychic activities. Now let's come back to ghosts and things like that. From my reading of talking to people of ghosts and apparitions, there tend to be two kinds. One I would call sort of the NPC version of the ghosts, which is they're sitting there repeating the same exact motion. Maybe you're in a house, and for some reason there's always a woman walking up the stairs, right? Or walking down the stairs, and it seems to from an earlier era, right? Wearing like clothes from an earlier era. And so that type of sighting is sort of a kind of a simpler one in a way, but in computer code it actually makes sense, because what it means is that code executed and that data is still there. So it wasn't completely cleaned out of the system. So in programming, there's something called garbage collection. And what happens is as you run some program, let's say even a video game or something else, if you run a program, it uses a bunch of memory. So it stores a bunch of information about what's happening. And then later, when you close the game or you go do something else, it doesn't actually clear that memory out. It just sits there. So all those values are still in memory. They're just not being used. And so at some point later in the process, there's a separate process called garbage collection that's looking around to say, hey, is this piece of memory being used? Is this piece of memory being used? And it's a very inexact process. So it'll clear out when it finds stuff, but it doesn't always clear out everything. And so it's why sometimes when you go to run a game again, you'll see the exact scene from the last time you played the game or something. And then eventually it'll start, again, so it'll clear everything and re-render everything. And so that could just be a glitch where it's rerunning the same code again and again, but it doesn't have all of the information there. It just has some basic information and it starts to look like an apparition. Then we get to, I think the more complex case is when you have apparitions and entities that are actually specifically talking to individuals.
Yeah.
So there was a book by Leslie Kane called Surviving Death. Do you know that book?
Yeah.
There's a really interesting case in that one of a ghost apparition in a house in Oakland, California. And the full chapter wasn't written by Leslie. It was written by somebody who investigates the paranormal. I'm forgetting his name, but this family moved into this house. And the young boy would say, that he sees this woman whose name is, I forget what it was, like Margaret or something, Marjorie, some name like that, who's wearing these funny clothes, and she's around and she talks to him. And every now and then the parents would catch a glimpse of a woman, wearing these old clothes. And then later, the boy would say, well, the woman told me her name was Marjorie and this and that. And they found out later that was the woman who had lived in the house before and who had died not that long ago. And then when this guy went to investigate in the car, you know, the ghost appeared in the car on the way to investigate. And later, what the ghost would tell the kid, because the kid could see her, like, and talk to her, whereas everybody else might catch a glimpse. She said, well, look, you're easier for me to talk to, so I'm showing myself to you, but I also control who else sees me. So that's why I can project myself into somebody else and say, okay, now you can see me. So that's more like a conscious entity. That's more like, you know, an actual player. In video games, there's something called ghost mode, where you can be in a room, but you know, you could be rendered in a ghostly way, or you could just not be rendered at all, but you're still there and you can still see what's happening and interact with people around. And again, if we are rendering the world, each of us is rendering it individually, then that's possible. We do this in video games all the time. And this will actually tie to the UFO phenomenon too. But suppose, you know, you're level 30 and I'm level 2. So I don't have very many skills. And you have the perceive dragons, you know, hidden dragons skill set. Okay, you'll be in the field and say, look, there's a dragon hiding right over there. And I'll look and I'll say, I don't see the dragon. And I'm not lying. I don't actually see it on my computer. Why? Because my computer is not rendering it for me, but your computer is rendering it for you. And so at the server, we decide, and you can even think of a game where you set the permissions. These people can see me and these people can't, right? So you're like a super user who has extra permissions that regular users don't have. And to me, the intelligent apparitions often are that way, including some of these that may happen at a Skinwalker Ranch, or if they follow people home. Like, not everybody sees the werewolves, but some people see them. Now, why is that? You know, maybe they have a certain skill set. So there's an overlap with the idea that the world isn't physical, and especially with things appearing and, you know, out of nowhere and then disappearing. And well, how do you move around in a complicated 3D world that has, like, you know, many planets? You don't have to go from point 1 to point 2. You portal over. Again, you just give it the XYZ. You don't have to walk from New York to Los Angeles, right? You can portal over, which basically means de-render you here and render you somewhere else, you know? So I think that this idea, this framework, if you will, of being in a video game opens up the possibility that things that's, you know, scientific people tend to say, oh, that's impossible. Well, it becomes possible in a rendered world that's based on information.
Yeah, and it's like a more organic type of video game because we're flesh and bone, and there's processes that follow every single thing that happens. I know another theory that does coincide and complements yours, and I have mentioned this to you on messages about Dr. Jacobo Grinberg. Have you ever heard about him?
You know, I've heard of him, but I don't know that much. Is it, what did he call it, the Syntelect or something like that? Or
Syntergic theory?
Syntergic, that's what it was.
Yeah, he studied shamans during his career for about 2 decades, and he disappeared in '94. Nobody knows what happened to him. There are many theories and everything, but his work was what was more important to me, because he developed this theory after studying shamans for about 2 decades, where he saw things that the shamans did that essentially allowed them to manipulate reality at their own will. And he believed, and he came up with this theory, that there is this neuronal field and then there is this lattice of reality. And he claimed that human brains, had the capability to make those two interact. And that is what generated the experience of reality. And I think that within your framework, within your simulation hypothesis, that would be an RPG, right?
Yeah, it would interface very well with the RPG version of the simulation hypothesis, where we are rendering, you know, this based on this information layer, and that certain people have access to be able to manipulate it. And if you think of like people who do psychic surgery, for example, speaking of shamans, you know, Pachita. It looks like they're, what's it called?
Pachita. That's the most famous Mexican shaman he investigated. Yeah. She's Mexican. Dr. Andrea Pujarich also went to investigate her, and she performed those. She claimed to be possessed essentially by the latest or the last Aztec emperor. That's what she claimed that was
Hmm.
happening to her.
Hmm. Well, what people report, and I haven't seen this in person, right? But they're putting their hands in. It looks like they're actually putting them inside the physical body, and like they're doing surgery. But then later
Yep.
they pull them out, and everything's fine. It's almost like the body is being rendered, and so even that is a representation of what they're actually doing, which is they're not actually reaching in your body, but that's what it looks like. They're manipulating the information that is used to generate your body, and once they're able to do that, the next time you render it. So there's this idea in the Sufi traditions and in the Buddhist traditions as well, like in the Dhammapada, which is like the sayings of the Buddha. He says, we are what we think, all that we are. The world is created by what we think in the moment, basically. And I don't remember the exact translation, but the idea is that we are creating the world every moment with our thoughts. So our reality is being created. And in the Sufi traditions, there's the same kind of thing, that moment by moment, the world is being created by God in this case. But if that's the case, then you can see how you can, render something that wasn't there and then get rid of it, whether it's an angel or it's a demon or some other thing that people see. And I think that's an interesting way to think about it, because that's how video games work. They get rendered over time. So his Syntergic theory sounds like it's very compatible. Also sounds
Yep.
like if he did in the 90s, it's probably very compatible with Michael Talbot's work in the holographic universe. I
Yeah,
think, and
it
David
is.
Bohm, who talked about the implicate order, like the implicate and the explicate. So what we see and then what's underneath that, as being two separate layers, I think.
Yeah. He
And then,
actually did his PhD in NYU. So he knew a lot of those people that were at the time in the 60s, 70s.
oh,
And
interesting.
yeah, he I'm very interested in his work because there were a set of conferences happening in the 80s
Hmm.
where he appears in pictures with Dr. Jacques Vallée, with
Hmm.
Dr. Buharich, with John Keel.
Hmm.
And apparently these conferences were happening in 85. They were 100 years old that were happening. So there were many scientists investigating phenomena, but it wasn't like mainstream really. And
No, it
that really
wasn't. Yeah.
surprised me. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, you can go back to the 1800s, and William James, who's, kind of the father of modern psychology, he was investigated this type of stuff, and it was considered a more legit pursuit back in the day. And then it became more of a fringe pursuit. But I'll have to ask Jacques next time I see him
Yeah.
about Dr. Greenberg, because I am fascinated by the theory and the way that he came about it. Did he witness things in his own life as well, or was it more he was studying these
Yeah.
shamans?
Yeah. Actually, people claim that he had the same skill Miss Dahlia has.
Hmm.
And he taught children how to do that in schools here in Mexico. And he also he went to Pachita when they introduced him to her.
Hmm.
He went planning to debunk everything she did, and
Hmm.
he just said, this is a very famous quote. He was like, "I was just planning to be there for 2 weeks. I ended up staying for 2 years, and I couldn't do it."
I see. Oh wow, that's interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah, because
and this,
once you see this stuff, it starts to get fascinating, and it kind of takes over your world view. I
yeah.
think is that it's different.
This is something that I wanted to ask you about, though, because you were talking about scientists at the beginning and how there is this like the more materialistic type of scientists who are like very, very pragmatic and they don't think anything's happening. But I've seen a sea change recently where
Hmm.
more and more scientists who have experienced stuff and have looked at stuff that they're trying to investigate are coming forward and they're being more brave about it. And what do you think that is? What do you think made that change happen? Because it's happening more and more often. I even saw Jacques talking about his experiences recently. I had
Hmm.
never seen him speaking about that, like OBEs and experiences with shadow beings and all this stuff.
Hmm.
What do you think made that change? You know?
Well, first of all, I do agree that there is a change, but I don't know how extensive it is, because I'm in academia now, and so I interact with scientists. I mean, there's still very strong materialist, point of view coming from these the scientists in general, but One of the areas I think that has opened it up a little bit is the UFO phenomenon. It has opened up discussion. And it's still generally considered a taboo subject by most academics. But since the December 17th story in 2017 about the Pentagon's program, the OSAP and ATIP and all that stuff, I think there has been more willingness to at least engage on it by individuals within academia. And so certain people, I mean, there's a lot more academics openly studying it now, like people like Dr. Kevin Knuth at Albany. You've got people like Gary Nolan at Stanford. And I spoke at the Soul Foundation conference last year. And, I know Gary well, and Avi Loeb out at Harvard. And there's others that are maybe not quite as open, but they're definitely studying it these days. That said, I did an actual study, an academic study of UFOs in academia. So I interviewed like 20 some professors who are openly studying it. And I asked them about the experience, and they said, well, it's a taboo subject in general. It has been. And the question is why? I asked them, so did somebody tell you you're not supposed to study UFOs? And they said, no, we just knew. And I said, well, how did you know that you're not supposed to study this subject? And he goes, the reason is there's a socialization that happens. Like with any group, you get socialized within that group, and you learn the do's and the don'ts and what's acceptable and not acceptable in that group. And so he said, science is actually like that. Academia is like that, but scientists in particular. And one of the ways that they define their identity is by saying, we are not like them, right? We are different. Like if you go to any religion, one of the ways they define themselves is how they're different from the other people. And so scientists and academics say, over time, you learn that this group makes fun of people who believe in things like Bigfoot, flat Earth, UFOs, ghosts, past lives, right? They just dump it all together into one big bucket of, there's a bunch of New Age people who believe a bunch of New Age crap, and we make fun of them because they're not scientific. We are logical. We are the scientists, right? And so that socialization happens because you see them making fun of that. And then you've got the people claiming certain things were hoaxes as well. And so they take those descriptions as reality, if you will. And then that becomes part of the ethos of being an academic. And so there's something called boundary work in the social studies of science. So there's science, there's social sciences, but then there's the social studies of science, which means you study scientists and see how they do things. And there's something called boundary work. And what boundary work is it's a rhetorical technique. It's something you use as a way to talk about things. And you use it to say, well, that's not science. This is science. That's pseudoscience. And so that term is used to create a stigma around certain topics. And that stigma still exists when you start talking about out-of-body experiences, even remote viewing. So while I agree that there are more people openly studying it, there also is still a pretty strong opposition within the academic community.
What do you think? What do you think should happen or must happen for that to change? Because that sort of approach, the mockery, the stigma, this is science because I say so. It feels dogmatic as well, just like any religion, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, it's very much. In fact, I'm writing another book now where I'm going deeper into the religious texts and simulation theory. And I talk about fundamentalists on both sides. There's fundamentalists who are the materialist scientists, and then the fundamentalists within each religion. Whereas most people tend to be somewhere in the middle. Just like in America, we have our Democrats and Republicans, and that's it. You only have these two choices. But the fact is, most people, are probably in that 60-70%. That's kind of in the middle, but you can only vote for one of two choices. And those guys tend to veer towards the extremes of their party to try to make their party happy. Right. And so it's the same kind of fundamentalism here. And I think, more people talking about their personal experiences does help. I think having academic centers. So one of the things I'm looking at doing Next is setting up an academic center within Arizona State University to where you can study these topics from all angles, from the scientific angle, the computer science angle, but also from the social sciences angle, from the religious angle, from the humanities angle. What if we were to study miracles and say, well, maybe they actually happened. Let's now talk about what that would mean for our society if miracles actually happened. Usually what happens in the study of religion is, people have told me this as I've talked to religious studies professors, is you have to either say, well, look, no miracles are happening today, therefore they never happened in the past because everything's the same. Or you have to be, totally believed in that religious tradition and say everything happened because of God, just the way that we said it. And that's it. There's no other explanation. It's just divine. There's no in between saying, well, what if they're real and there's a mechanism by which these things happen? And what would that mean for our understanding of reality? And there are more people like Dr. Diana Pasulka. I don't know if you know,
Yes.
You probably know her in the UFO world.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. And, she was a Catholic scholar. And so what happened a few years ago, I was asked to write a book by HarperCollins India. Okay, now I'm not in India, I'm in the U.S. I was born in Pakistan, and they said it's the 75th anniversary of a very famous book called Autobiography of a Yogi. Now, I don't know how well this book is known, say, in Mexico, but in the U.S., it became a classic. It became the book that introduced in the 60s and 70s. So you were talking about that time frame. Most of those people were introduced to yoga and meditation by reading this book. In fact, I think I have a copy of the paperback edition of the book here. Some people may have seen it,
Yeah.
And basically, Yogananda came over to the U.S. in 1920. So it was literally 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. And he started teaching here. And he's one of the first swamis to actually live in America and to try to teach ideas of yoga to the West. And so the hippies would basically pass this book around, like, in Haight-Ashbury and all these places. They would get it and they would read it. And like George Harrison would give away, from the Beatles, would give away copies of this book to everybody. And Steve Jobs, it was his favorite book. When he died, his memorial service, they gave away copies at Stanford. So it became kind of a classic here. And in India, it got better known over time because he wasn't actually preaching in India. I mean, he was here. And the book has a lot of Christian things in there because it's written for an audience. But a lot of the stories are like what we would say are miracles. There's like yogis who can float, yogis who appear in two places at once. You have people reading each other's minds. You have telepathy going on. You have, sort of out-of-body experiences. You have individuals living for hundreds of years, looking like they're age 25, people who don't eat for years. So you have all of these different things happening, miraculous healings happening. And so really he told a bunch of stories. And so HarperCollins India said, hey, it's the 75th anniversary of that book, because that book was published in like 1946, I think. And they said, why don't you would you like to write for us, for India now, for young people in India, a book about the lessons of Swami Yogananda? And I said, well, wait, are you sure you want me to write this book? I'm not a Swami. I mean, I like Yogananda. I've studied his work and I quote him, but I'm not like a formal part of his organization. And I'm not even Hindu, right? I grew up as a Muslim, even though I've studied a lot of Hinduism and Buddhism. I spent a lot of time in those traditions, probably more than the one that I grew up with. But they said, yes, because we want you to use your ideas of technology in the world as a way to describe these ancient concepts, like Maya, like karma, and using your video game metaphor. And so as I researched his life, I found that he was doing the same thing back in the 1920s and 1930s. He was using new technology as a way to explain these ancient ideas, which were very unfamiliar to people in the West. And so he used the analogy of the film projector, which was new technology, right? Yeah. And he said he saw like these newsreels of World War I, and he would go to the cinema and watch movies. And he said, look, we are in a cosmic movie. It's like a film. Okay, the suffering is happening inside the film to the characters, but the actors aren't harmed by what's happening inside the film. And so we are all part of this film. And he said, you have to look away from the screen, and we get caught up in the action, and to see the light that's coming. Okay, now that is a technological metaphor, right? He doesn't mean there's a physical projector. He means it's something like that. And so I became convinced in writing that book that if he were alive today, he would do kind of what I'm doing right now, which is he would say that reality is like a film. We are the actors playing the characters, but we're also the audience. So we're watching the whole thing as we do it. It's interactive. We have scripts, each of us, but we can change the script anytime we want, and we have to respond to those changes, and we have to live with the consequences of our actions within that film, and that affects the next part that we're going to play. And so what does that sound like? That sounds like a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. So that's, I think, a metaphor. I don't remember exactly how we got down this particular path, your question you asked, but for me, that's a way of showing that you can use new metaphors to try to describe it. And the video game is the best metaphor to do that now.
It also goes hand in hand with something that I wanted to ask you, because you spoke about this Yogi. There are protocols that have been used throughout history by these people. And right now there are protocols too. Plato had protocols as well. And it seems like we have forgotten a lot about these protocols over time with the technological revolution and everything. I am one of the people who feels and believes that psi phenomena is very, very real, and that we are only scratching the surface when we talk about remote viewing or other aspects of psi phenomena. Why do you think it has been forgotten so to that extent? Because those tales from that Yogi, they coincide with a lot of tales, for example, that shamans used to perform a lot of these miracles as well, and the skinwalker phenomenon. And what do you think happened along the way? What prevented from these wisdoms to remain untouched throughout time?
Well, I think there's two aspects to it, and one of which you can actually see in Yogananda's book, because he wrote this book in 30s and 40s in Encinitas, actually, just north of San Diego, right on the Pacific Ocean. There's a beach there now called Swami's Beach, and his hermitage is still there with a beautiful garden. But many of the stories took place when he was a kid in India, because he moved when he was like 27. So, he spent, like, say, this first 25 years of his life in India, and then he spent the rest of his life in the US. And so these stories took place in the 1890s, 1900s, and 19-teens. So it wasn't that long ago compared to, like, say, stories of Jesus and the miracles, or, Moses, and Buddha, those were like thousands of years ago, right? And so even in that book, you see that his father works for the railroad, and he tells him, well, you need to get a real job so you can make some real money. Don't go be a swami. And his brother-in-law is like, why do you want to be a dirty swami? Why can't you get a real job and use modern technology, right? And
fucking hippies.
Yeah, exactly, right? And there are times when for example, there's a famous story of where his master was supposed to come in the 9 o'clock train from Calcutta back to the town where he was in college, and he studied with him in Serampore, which is not that far from Calcutta. But he was supposed to come on the 9 o'clock train, and Yogananda gets this message psychically. It says, I'm not going to be in the 9. Don't bother meeting me at the station. I'm going to be at the 10 o'clock train. And his friend doesn't get the message. And his friend is like, no, I have to go to the station. We have to go meet our master, our guru. Because we told him, and that's what he told us, he's going to be there at 9. And Yogananda's like, no, I just got the message from him. And so his friend went there, and he wasn't there. And then Yogananda came back and showed up at 10 with him. And then he was there. And he's like, well, what happened, right? Well, he got the message. He sent the message to both of his disciples, but only one of them got the message. The other one didn't get it. And that was because his mind wasn't calm enough. And so today, that's the equivalent of a text message, right? So if we can do a text message, why would we develop our intuition to get these messages? Because text messages are more reliable. Everybody will get the text message. So I think technology has played a role, right, in that. Now, there are other societal factors, whether it's in the West, you have the Catholic Church, which actually acknowledges miracles and saints. In fact, we were talking about Diana Pasulka. I think that might have been what got me down the Yogananda rabbit hole, where she said that she was socialized. Like as a kid, she read Autobiography of Yogi. She grew up in a Catholic home in San Francisco, right? So, I mean, she grew up with like probably the daughter of hippies, right?
Yeah, very
And
open-minded. Yeah.
yeah, and she would read the Catholic saints and she would read Yogananda stories and she would think, yeah, it's all the same stuff. She believed it all. And then she said when she became a professor of religion, so this is interesting, she was socialized to not take it so seriously, to say, okay, well, those are just stories. And by the way, it's okay in academia to study psychic phenomena and UFOs in one particular way. That's totally accepted, particularly in the social sciences. It is to say, why do these crazy people believe this crazy stuff? We're just going to study what these people believe. That's totally fine if you want to say that. But if you want to say that these people are actually seeing real objects or experiencing real, psi phenomena, then you get, much more pushback and things against you. And she said that then when she went to the Vatican to study the canonization records of Joseph of Cupertino, who was one of the floating saints, and she said she saw like signatures from thousands of people who saw this guy float in the square, like not just in the he did it in the church a lot, but it would happen spontaneously, and he would float up to the height of a tree, and everybody would kind of see it outside, and he'd be in this kind of frozen state. There's a great book called They Flew, which is an academic book, so it's a little too detailed for most people, but it really goes into different Catholic saints from that time period, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, that supposedly levitated, and some of them bilocated as well. And she said then she thought, well, okay, maybe these stories are true and that we've been taking the wrong road inside academia. So, but I do think there's a socialization within the Western world in particular, and then as the rest of the world has adopted Western technologies and Western modes of dressing and thinking, then they also have those things become less acceptable as a thing to do. So on the one hand, we don't need them as much, so we don't develop them, but it still happens to most people when there's a traumatic event, like, a mother, can sense when their kid is in trouble, or if their child dies, or if your parent dies. Usually there's some premonition, there's something that it's such a common thing. It happens so often where a close family member, you get a premonition of it or something simultaneously at the same time that happens. So I think all of those, but also science has been fighting this battle against religion since the time of Galileo, right? And so at that time, the church was the cultural authority, and they suppressed science as a way of figuring out things. He said, you just read the scriptures. And, that's how the only path to truth. Now, what's happened over time is that science has won that battle, at least in the Western societies, where now they've taken over that role. They say, we are the only road to truth, right? And so because of that, people just don't believe this stuff can happen. That's why children can do these things, like in these psi classes, or if you go to see a spoon bending class, children can do these things, or mind sight. I was just in Switzerland with a group with Tom Campbell and a few other people, and there was a European school of mind sight, and the kids were like doing it better than the adults. And it's because, they don't have the same level of conditioning. There's a great story about spoon bending. So there was a guy, and of course, most mainstream people just dismiss it as that's a hoax. What's his name? Uri Geller. Uri Geller was a hoax. We all know he was a hoax. Therefore, why do you even talk about this stupid shit? That's kind of how they react if you bring it up to anybody, right? But there was a guy who was an aerospace engineer named Jack Houck, and he started to have these spoon bending parties. He called them PK parties for, psychokinesis, and they would do other things as well, but the spoon bending was the main thing. And he found that if you had a group of at least 15 people, it was actually much easier to do it. And I've experienced this myself, right? So I know it's like much easier to bend a spoon like this one when I'm in a group at a spoon bending party. And I've seen little girls who are like 11 years old take the spoon and go whoop, just bend it and put like multiple loops in there. I mean, I could barely get it initially, like to just bend at all with strength, but then later there's a moment when it gets soft and you bend it. And so this guy, Jack Houck, went to Los Alamos, and he did a spoon bending party. And there were a bunch of physicists and their wives. And back then, physicists were mostly men and their wives. And he found that the wives could do it, but the physicists couldn't. Right? And it gets back to the conditioning. Now, there's an
Yeah.
asterisk or footnote on that story, which is that if the physicist was there with his wife and none of the other physicists in a party, then they could do it. But if the physicist was there with other physicists, right, then they couldn't. And it's almost like there's this mental projection of what's possible and what's not, and what's acceptable and what's not. And it's there at a subtle level. And so, we have to break that up over time by having more people actually experience these things to start to believe them. But then we have to have theories which you can at least discuss with people, because it's not enough for just to say you have to experience it. You have to come up with a mechanism or a model, and then try to say, okay, this happens sometimes. And simulation hypothesis is a good model, because I can talk about simulation theory with a Buddhist monk. I can talk about it with, the most UFO Galactic Federation contactee, right, person. And I can talk about it with a physicist, with a computer scientist, with a social scientist. Now, they may not buy it, but at least they'll talk to me about it. They won't talk to me about UFOs, or they won't talk about, if you start talking about angels appearing, they'll just kind of tune out and say, yeah, you're one of those superstitious people, right? But if I say, well, think of it, if the universe is a simulation or a hologram of some type, then in a video game, you can project something that looks like an angel, but it's actually a computer program. And then they're like, well, I guess, that would be possible if we were in a simulation. So at least you got the conversation started. But we're not in a simulation, they might say, but at least you got them to discuss the possibility.
Somebody who went through an entire process, and I watched it unfold, is Nick Cook. He told me to send you his best.
Yes, in fact, I just chatted with him at the Soul Foundation in
he told
Italy.
Me. He told me, and he's gone like from nuts and bolts completely to we're living in a simulation. And I've been reading his entire stuff all throughout, and I'm like, whoa, that's a journey.
Well, what's funny is so I met him, and I didn't know he was into the simulation theory, because I had read his book, The Hunt for Zero Point, years ago. Like even before I started to really investigate the phenomena for myself. And I remember thinking it was pretty interesting. And then we met and we started talking, and it turns out, he was already reading my book. He just put out a blog post today about our interaction and how we came to the conclusion that the world is a simulation in different ways. I came from the video game world and thinking about how would you actually implement this stuff. And he came at it from nuts and bolts, but then he started investigating all of these other things. So it's really interesting that's where he ended up, and you can see his process that he went through.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about last year you gave a speech at Seoul Conference, a presentation about how the business side of the UAP technology, how it can be applied. And you come from Silicon Valley, you come from entrepreneurship. But I don't know if you've noticed, though, but what some people are trying to do by uncovering whatever the UFO topic is, government stuff included, it comes with a baggage. It comes with, we have to leave the materialistic paradigm and change the paradigm in order to change things. But I don't see it yet. I don't know if you can explain it to me, but if we do leave this paradigm as we find out whatever is going on behind this, including the government secrecy, and especially that, how do you think we could change the paradigm without it being too disruptive to everyday life?
Well, so first of all, I think the people who are pursuing business ventures and technology ventures in this field. So I wrote a white paper for the Soul Foundation and gave a talk, and people can find the white paper online. I think it was called like UAP, building a UAP investment ecosystem, based on my experience in Silicon Valley. And I talked about how UFO tech, in some ways, there's like regular tech, or reg tech, as it's called sometimes, which is what a lot of VCs invest in, like websites, now AI applications, all this stuff, mobile apps, games, which is what I did. I was in the video game industry. And then there's deep tech, which tends to be, things that take longer to build. And a lot of times that's, like space, like SpaceX, Tesla, cars, electric. A lot of it is climate change related in terms of investments, but quantum computing is there now too. But then I defined an area that I call frontier tech, which is like one level beyond that, which not only do we not know the engineering. So if you think of SpaceX, they didn't really invent any new science, but it was a startup that took many years to succeed because they were building rockets, and they had to come up with better engineering, and they did eventually, but they had lots of failures along the way. Most startups, to have your rockets blow up like that, they wouldn't have enough money to continue; they would just die. And that's why there's this deep tech investing space to try to support those ventures. But in the end, Elon Musk didn't have to change his view of the physical universe. They just had to have better engineering so that they can have these rockets go up and come down. And so they were much better at it. It was efficiency and engineering, and they had many problems, by the way, that were completely original. They had to solve, but they didn't have to change physics to do it. And so worry, but my assertion is that for UFO type technology, and there is a physical aspect, right? I mean, there is a nuts and bolts aspect to UFOs.
Yeah.
And actually, there's a great story that Jacques Vallée told me that ties to how I started to see the overlap between the simulation space and the UFO world. And it ties to what we were talking about earlier about ghosts and paranormal stuff. He said that he went to investigate this one UFO sighting, and they said that the UFO had come down at a 45-degree angle and it landed in some clearing. This was in Northern California. Now, if you've been to Northern California, there's these big trees, evergreen trees, sometimes redwood, sometimes other types of trees, but they're all like these giant trees, and into Oregon, like that area. And so the MUFON and everybody else came and investigated, and then they wrote down, what happened, and they went away. And Jacques stayed behind because that's what he tends to do, which is to really get to know people. And he went back to the scene with them, and he said, look, you said the UFO came down at a 45-degree angle and it landed in the clearing. They're like, yeah. And he goes, but that means it would have had to go directly through the trees on the way down because the trees are so tall that to go at 45 degrees, you would have had to cut through the trees. But the trees are still there. I mean, they're not cut. They're still there. And the witnesses said, yes, that's right. But we didn't want to say that because we would sound crazy to the other investigators. So literally the UFO went through the trees. It was like a non-physical version of it, like a hologram or a rendering that can go through. And then it landed. And by the time it landed, it was physical. It was like, you could like knock on it. And so that, I think, gets at the heart of the UFO mystery and why consciousness is involved, and why it's both a physical and non-physical phenomena. And in a video game, in a simulation, and that's, when I was thinking about simulation theory, Jacques was telling me about this. It was, in fact, you can render something, and while you're rendering it, it doesn't have to obey the laws of physics within that scene. You can go through walls, and then finally, when everything is fully rendered, then, it's not going to let your hand go through the wall anymore. Until you de-res, right? So you de-render it. And so that's another case where I think, there's a big overlap between these two. But now, so the people pursuing the ventures are only looking at that kind of last stage of it. But I do think that there is an element of that last stage. So I told you at the beginning of this interview that I got into the UFO phenomenon through a guy named Foster Gamble, and he was looking for free energy technologies which could just produce over unity. And he's seen some of those in the past. And oftentimes they were shut down, their labs were shut down. And he said that when he saw them working, they had this interesting white glow, and they weren't hot to touch, but they produced this kind of glow. And that's interesting because it was in a toroidal type shape, like a donut type shape, right? And so the torus, he thinks, is the shape. And that's what a lot of that film, is about that. And it's also about a lot of other stuff, like who's suppressing the technology, the banking family.
Have you seen Bob Greenier's work?
No, I haven't.
You're going to like it. I'm going to send it to you.
Okay.
He talks about toroidal moments a lot, and it's really, really interesting. He
talks about, sorry, what? He talks about what a lot?
Toroidal moments.
Oh, really? Cool. Yeah, that's very interesting. I'd be open to that.
How do you think it could apply eventually economically to not disrupt the current model? Because I know that Carl Nell keeps talking about catastrophic disclosure and how it would affect society on a wider scale. But do you think there is a way to not affect the current way of life and still jump into
Well,
those technologies?
well, I think there is, and that would be a limited disclosure or a backdoor disclosure, and that's kind of what I was advocating in the paper. Is that right now, you've got kind of these guys studying this thing in secret, studying the technology, and like Eric Davis has talked about these programs, and then you've got an aerospace industry, for example, that doesn't know anything about these, right? And there are supposedly aerospace companies where there are groups that have investigated this, but they're so blocked off from everything else, and that's what the Hunt for Zero Point, right, was partly about his investigations into the aerospace industry. But by allowing pieces of that technology to get commercialized in ways that could be perhaps not all at once. And in fact, according to Eric Davis, we haven't figured it all out yet. In fact, Jim Lukatsky, who was also heading up like OSAP, talked about how we may have figured out some of it, like how things live, but we haven't figured out how these craft fully fly. Just this week, right, on the Weaponized podcast. And so by allowing scientists to validate that and being more open about it, we could have companies with innovations and products. I mean, if you think about, the car industry is being disrupted today. Why? Because Elon Musk and the founders of Tesla, they came out with the electric cars and they came out with innovation, and this happens all the time, right? IBM is no longer the dominant computer company. Why? Because other companies came out with products that were better and smaller, and then those products grew. And so you could release, if you could figure out how it worked, you could release products that could do aspects of this, and then you could have a capitalist model that continues to work. Like for me, disclosure isn't, for me, like, okay, what difference is it going to make if the government says, okay, there are other beings in our universe? For me, it would become interesting if I can get inside a craft and go to the moon or go to Mars and see what's out there.
That would speak to one of these beings too.
Or speak to one of these beings, right? But we're never going to get there unless it gets out. And so I asked, one of these guys who was let's say he's a key member of the of OSAP, okay, and I said, well, why can't we get the scientists at MIT? Why can't we get the best and brightest? Because they don't think this stuff exists, basically, for the most part, right? And I said, well, why can't we get those guys to study it? And then once they publish papers on how it works, then entrepreneurs can build. He's like, no. Every other word out of his mouth was China, China, China. And he said, if we give it to MIT, we give it to Harvard, China's going to know about it. And then China's going to do it. And so they're caught in this tribal rivalry. Right? And I think we need to get out of this tribal rivalry. And unfortunately, I mean, we're both here in North America. If you look at the history of the Indian tribes here, they were all fighting against each other. I mean, that was part of the reason why the European colonization occurred, is because the tribes could never unite, despite, certain Native American leaders like Tecumseh trying to unite them. But like all the Eastern tribes went first, and then the Midwestern tribes, of course, down in Mexico, you've got a whole different, but similar situation, more of an integrated situation, perhaps. But so I think we're like the Pequot and the Massachusetts. Right? Those are two tribes that existed near Boston that are no longer around. Right? Rather than working together and integrating, they were too busy fighting each other. Now, I'm not saying that the UFOs are necessarily trying to take over the Earth in the same way. I'm just saying that we need to cooperate better, and that would make it a lot easier for this thing to get out there.
Do you think that's why they're like, some people are trying to push sort of like a threat narrative to convince everybody that they should unite? Do you think that's viable?
That's, Ronald Reagan said that, right, at the UN.
Yeah.
And some people speculate that was because he had conversations with the Russians about this particular topic. Some people think governments aren't the right. Now, there's another theory that I have, which is just a theory, so I don't have access to classified information. But you know how in the nuclear world we have the IAEA, and we say, okay, these guys can have nuclear weapons and these guys can't. And, they go into Iran or whoever we decide can't have nuclear weapons. And then they say you're not allowed to have this, you can have civilian power. But it's like it's like an agency separate from the individual governments. Right?
Yeah.
Is it possible that this technology, which is so world changing, is also being managed by a group that is like that doesn't want this technology to be out there with too many groups or too many people, because maybe there's some harm that could be done? Like, for example, could it tear the fabric of space-time as well if everybody was creating their own UFO technology? I'm not saying that's necessarily the case. This is just a theory in terms of, is there in fact, and that's not even part of the government itself. And this is kind of like X-Files theory stuff. But I met Chris Carter once, who was the creator of the X-Files, at a conference in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it was like well after the original X-Files and before the new X-Files, and it was a secret space program conference, and he was just sitting there taking notes the whole time. And then when the new X-Files came out, you saw the things that people had talked about at that conference.
Yeah, they talk about the TR3B and all that stuff.
Yeah, he talked about it in the new X-Files, right?
Yeah.
He was sitting there literally taking notes at these conferences about this stuff. And actually, Foster and Kimberly Gamble who like took me to that conference to meet him.
What you're talking about right now is a perfect segue to discuss the final part that I want to talk about. Because Mark Andreessen, I'm sure maybe you know him probably.
I don't know him personally, but he's he's well known.
He talked about,
interacted with him at some point in the past. Yeah.
We are seeing this happening in real time, that like there's a group that is trying to sort of classify technology with AI, because Mark Andreessen recently stated that they classified entire fields of physics way back when, and they're trying to do the same with AI right now. So and with that context, where do you think AI is going right now? And then I'll ask you the next question. But do you think that it's going to be that disruptive? How do you think life will change if we get to that AGI place?
Well, so I'm not an AI doomer like a lot of people are in the press. In fact, I thought of writing an article and maybe a book called "AI Will Kill Us All and Other Myths." Right? And part of the reason why is in academia I study narratives. Particularly from science fiction narratives. I've referenced here already probably The Matrix, Star Trek, and X-Files.
I also reposted something you wrote about a letter from Philip K. Dick to the Blade Runner creators. I reposted that was amazing to read, man.
It was. It really was amazing. I'll have to ask Tessa if that was a real letter. His wife, his ex-wife. I think they had been divorced before he died, but still. It's really interesting. But sometimes we take these narratives from media and then they become the thing that we're worried about. And I'm not saying AI won't have problems. AI will definitely cause societal problems. Just like the automobile,
or the internet.
Yeah, or the internet or the telephone. I mean, these things had wide-ranging consequences, right? I mean, think of all the people in London who would just run around delivering notes to people in the middle of the day, right? If you ever watch like Downton Abbey or something, people are sending like these little envelopes, or in New York in the 1800s, there's like a huge group of people who were just couriers, right? What happened to all those jobs? They all disappeared when the telephone came out. And sometimes you can predict that, and sometimes you can't. And oftentimes the problems you predict aren't the ones that really happen. So like with automobile, farmers were against automobiles. You know why? Because there were all these dirt roads everywhere, and the dirt roads were built for for horses. Yeah. And what would happen is when the automobile went by, it would kick up dust all over their fields. And so farmers it was noisy. It would scare their cattle. So they were against them. But now, so there was a pollution problem, but it was a different kind of pollution problem. And they were already trying to solve the pollution problem of, with cars, the pollution problem of all the horse crap everywhere in the cities. There was so much of it, right? But nobody really expected that automobile would create a different pollution problem, right? I mean, no matter what you think of climate change, I mean, look at Los Angeles or Mexico City in the 1970s or 1980s. You'll see a lot of smog and smoke. And so sometimes the problems, like the problem with social media, ended up being like this kind of addiction. And this tribalism. Like that wasn't really what we were, worried about in the beginning necessarily.
We didn't
And
even
so,
imagine it would happen in the first
yeah,
place.
and that often happens with new technology. So first of all, I do think we will get to AGI at some point, but I don't think we're as close as people say. Like every year they're like, yeah, we're going to get there next year. It was supposed to be 2025 last year and 24. Now it's 26. Now it'll be 27. And the reason why is that we're in the kind of second great wave of AI. The first wave of AI was in the 1980s, and it was all rules based. They were trying to write rules like code that told the AI what to do, and they would encapsulate knowledge in these rules. But it really couldn't do anything that you couldn't code, in rules. So it wasn't really AI per se. But that wave happened. A lot of companies got funded, and then it died. The second great wave started with machine learning and big data and neural nets. And so that's the wave that kind of happened in the 20 teens up to, let's say, today's LLMs. But LLMs aren't so good at reasoning. They're great at predicting what the next word should be. And sometimes they seem to be channeling something, because it's pretty impressive what can happen. But one of the problems that's already happening is people are getting addicted to their AI companions, right?
Yeah.
They're having AI girlfriends. You've got, LLMs
A
customized
girl
to be.
just got married to her.
Yes, a
To her
Japanese
AI.
woman, right? I think
Yes.
yes. And there was
Yes.
a guy who proposed, who was already married, proposed to his ChatGPT. So you're getting a different kind of problem. But LLMs are good for many things. And so they're adding stuff to them to try to get them to be able to reason. So they call them reasoning models. Because when we learn something, like with basketball, we do learn it from experience, but we do also memorize some rules. Like, okay, you need to put the basketball this way, put your hand on the left, and then lift it like this, and then do that, and don't move this hand, or whatever the rules are. And then we practice those rules, and we find our own specific best way to do it. And so eventually we will have a merging of these. And there's a whole, in my book, in the simulation hypothesis, I talk about what I call the metaverse Turing test. So the Turing test you've probably heard of, which is when if you're chatting with, say, a chatbot, it was originally framed as a messaging test. And one of them is an AI or a computer, and one of them is a human, and you can't tell the difference. Then the computer or the AI would have passed the Turing test. Now with ChatGPT and recent LLMs, most people think we're there. Like it's possible to have the LLM act in such a way that it's very difficult for you to tell. You can probably still tell, but most people think we passed the Turing test. Like if we really want to, with tests that they've done, like it produces text that's so good that it could have been produced by a human. But in the metaverse Turing test, you're inside a video game, and your character is there with two other characters, one of which is controlled by a human, and one of which is controlled by an AI. And so you have to go around, and it has to have spatial intelligence is the term they're calling it now. And you've got world labs, which can generate, an AI world that you can move around, not just like an image or a video, but you can actually navigate and move back around. Google has that as well. So they're trying to get AI to understand 3D space. And the best way to do that is inside a virtual world, inside a video game, if you will. That's how they've trained all these cars. Like the cars have been trained, self-driving cars. We have them here. I don't know if you have them there where you are, but in Phoenix, we've had them for a while. And I lived in Mountain View back in 2007. I used to see, the Waymo cars coming and going from the Google headquarters, which was just down the road there. And now, I see 2, 3, 4 at a time here in Phoenix. It kind of reminds me of what it must have been like in like 19 teens when mostly it was horses, but there were a few actual automobiles on the road. We're going down that direction, but a lot of the training for those all happens in virtual worlds because it's much safer that way. If the car makes a mistake, you're not, killing someone or crashing into something. And of course, now they have millions of miles of real world experience as well. But you use a combination of the two. So I do think, we will get to AGI as we start to basically teach these models how to reason, like how to have rules and make up new rules and learn new things, but also how to navigate spaces. So I think eventually we'll get there. But I don't think that AI by itself is going to, super intelligent AI will take over the world. My worry is that not so intelligent AI not super intelligent AI, but very intelligent, will be used by people to kill other people. And that we're already seeing that.
Yeah,
with
it's already
drones.
happening.
That to me is the bigger danger. So if you think of the Terminator storyline, back to science fiction, it started with the military trying to create a computer that could control all these AI. Now, in the Terminator, the super intelligent computer took over and decided to kill humanity. I'm less worried about that part than this arms race with these AI-based weapons, where we're going to all kill each other using the AI weapons, and then war becomes a lot easier because you don't have to risk your people. Problem is that the other side doesn't have to risk their people either when they send you the AI killer robots. That worries me much more.
Oh man. Based on what Andreessen said, though, about AGI probably being classified in many aspects,
Yeah.
do you think, and also the control disclosure movement as well, where they talk about things, but they need to have permission to talk about things. How do you view this overclassification of stuff, whether it's science or the UFO topic? How do you view that? Because I think it's a real problem, in my opinion.
Well, I agree. So I think what Andreessen was talking about was that they met with the Biden administration. And the Biden administration was saying, we're going to classify AI stuff. And he said, you can't do that. It's just science and math. And they said, oh, you want to bet? We have classified entire areas of physics in the past. Now, I don't think they said specifically that they were classifying AI information. I don't think Andreessen said that. But he said that they said they could. And that was the thing that really scared him. And that's why a lot of people in that world ended up shifting away and supporting Trump, right, rather than Biden. It was an interesting shift. I mean, Silicon Valley is still very much, in the U.S., it's very much a Democratic stronghold within the state of California. But it was interesting that you had this kind of shift going on because of over regulation and control. But that ties to this issue. I mean, there's many people who think that anti-gravity stuff was classified in the 50s and 60s. And Nick Cook talks about that a lot.
Jesse too.
And you can get, Jesse too. And you can look at those articles. I mean, there are actual articles from like the Miami Herald, New York.
The G engines are coming.
Yeah, the G engines are coming. All those are out there. So I think that is a major problem. And the main reason for that gets back to what I was saying earlier, which is that they are more worried about geopolitical concerns and being better than China, being better than Russia. They're more concerned about human wars than they are about the fate of humanity as a whole. That said, what's interesting right now is you have people like Lukatsky, maybe even Stratton, Elizondo, Eric Davis, saying that it's no longer classified to say we have recovered craft and that we are not alone. If you say any more than that, then you get into classified information, right? I mean, they've clearly said that. Lukatsky said this in his book. Elizondo said it in his book, which passed the Doppler review. Eric Davis has said this multiple times. These programs do exist. So the boundary has actually been pushed a bit over the last 10 years or so, and I think that's a positive sign. But I don't think we're going to get the broad acceptance. Like you and probably everybody else in the UFO world, I'm looking forward to this new film, The Age of Disclosure. But I'm not as optimistic that it's going to change people's minds that are not, that are in like the scientific community. I have these discussions all the time with people, and they just say, well, that could just be a random classified weapons program. It doesn't have to have anything to do with NHI or non-human intelligence. That's just technology that's what we do. We have technology special access programs, and people who are in the military, say this stuff, but they don't know that much about the subject. They haven't talked to these people, and they've never seen anything themselves. So on the one hand, we have more people than ever being open to it and talking about it, but we also have this kind of weird it's almost like you have a hardening of the opposite view, saying that this is just ridiculous, that there's
it comes with the tribalism of the era, right?
It comes with the tribalism of the era, and that is very true. And interestingly enough, I'm finding that people who are more religious are more open to this idea of NHI than people who are like the what we would call the rationalist atheists. They're like, no, that's ridiculous. Science has told us that doesn't happen.
So, two more questions I have for you. Who or what do you think is controlling the simulation, though?
Well, that's the big question, right? I don't take a strong position. I just lay out the possibilities, and then I tell you what my personal preference is. But that's a personal preference. That's not necessarily me basing it on a particular scientific algorithm or anything like that. But some people say it's us. It's a future version of us who are more advanced than us, who are running what they call an ancestor simulation. And so that would be like us making a simulation of Rome, for example, or of Greece or ancient China or whatever. Then there are those who say, well, it's aliens, it's non-humans. They're running this simulation. And that's why they pop in sometimes to check on us, right? That's why these beings can change form and look however they, in a different form. And then you have the stories of the Fae and the Jinn in the Middle East, and I'm sure there's probably similar stories in Latin America. The Greek gods, but also more like these ongoing beings who are still around, right? Who would come and interact like the Fae or the fairies, if you will, in the Celtic traditions. They would come in and they would take people into their world and they would come back. And the same with the Jinn. It's like they're just other races. They're here with us. We just can't see them, but they can make themselves visible, and then they can have physical effects in terms of what they do. Some people say they're angels or demons, but there's that whole element of they're not really aliens. They're just other beings that are projecting themselves into this reality and telling us that they're aliens. Whereas in the past, they told us they were angels, or they told us they were demons, or they told us they were jinn, because that's how we can process it today. Just like in the 50s, if you asked people, where's the alien invasion going to come from? They'll say it's going to come from Mars, right? Because Mars attacks. That was like the narrative. So we get these cultural narratives in our minds. So it could be a non-human race like that. It could also be a more spiritual perspective, and that we are non-physical beings outside the simulation who come in, and we take on roles within the simulation. And that's my favorite theory of the different theories. And I'm not saying that there's only one simulation. I mean, when people have near-death experiences, we didn't get too deep into that today, but they talk about seeing similar things. And I don't know if you had a life review in yours.
I did.
Or you did? Oh, interesting. And
yeah.
And what was that like?
I spoke to Nick about this because he has studied it quite extensively. And for the longest time, I didn't think I had like a near-death experience because I didn't lose consciousness. I had a fear-death experience. And I asked him, I was like, that's a thing? He's like, yeah, I investigated it. And after I went to sleep, after the experience, that's when I had a really vivid dream about being in a place where they were talking to me about everything that I've experienced throughout my life and the potential other avenues that I could have taken. It was really weird.
Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting. And I talk about the life review a lot in my recent book, because there was a guy named Daniel Brinkley. I don't know if you know him. He was struck by lightning. He wrote a book called Saved by the Light.
I've heard of him.
He's died several times. He's one of these guys who's like died. And he talked about a being of light, and he talked about reviewing a holographic panoramic review of everything in his life. And for me, the question is, if you can recreate it and you can experience it from other people's point of view, it would have to be recorded somehow. And that is much, much more easily possible in a virtual world than it is in a physical world. And then you have this life preview idea, which I've started to get really interested in, which is us planning our life and saying, here's the possible paths we might have taken. We might take in the future because we're just starting the life. And so it's interesting to me that you remembered in your dream, which was while you were back, this experience. And I had similar experience after I had my heart surgery, where it wasn't during the time that I was out in the surgery. It was afterwards I started to have these visions. And I did a lot of shamanic journeying with drums before. It was just like a shamanic journey. It was like I was going to this place and I could talk to these guys, and they were teaching me things. And it made a profound impact on my life too. So that's kind of my favorite theory, is that it's us outside the simulation, but even what we report seeing, like some people say life review occurred in a like a movie auditorium. You know, other people say it occurred in like a place with a bunch of TV screens. Other people say it occurred, like these might be simulated as well as a way for us to understand how to review this world. So there may be a couple of levels deep, but I feel like it's us outside the simulation. And then eventually maybe you get to something like a god or a one.
The architect.
The architect, yes, out there. Right? But maybe it's just more advanced versions of us that are, you know, people that have been here a while who help to create and maintain things that are going on. Just like in a game, you know, we end up adding downloadable content. We end up changing things. Somebody monitors it all the time and decides what's best or worst, depending on your definition to do next. Like Elon Musk says, the most entertaining option is the one that's likely to happen, right? For people watching the simulation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Last question though. And this comes from my friends at Living Life Consciously. They asked me to ask this question to my guests, and I really like it. So here goes. What is your greatest hope for the future of humanity?
That's a good question. I mean, my greatest hope for the future of humanity is that we use the lessons of the life review and we take it to heart, which is that what actually matters is how we treat other people here. That is what we're going to review at the end of the game. So if the world is a game, I don't think it's Grand Theft Auto where you're trying to like abuse as many people as possible, steal as many things as possible, right? And my greatest hope for humanity is that we realize that there is a wisdom that was given to us in all the religious traditions. And it turns out this life review is present in some form or another in pretty much all the religious texts. They all use different metaphors. They use books. They use, you know, today we could say it's a database. They have gods, minor gods. They have angels writing things down with pens. They use all kinds of flowery language, but they're basically talking about recording everything that happened and reviewing it. And that, you know, you have a storyline that you laid out for yourself and you're free to choose. But those particular quests and challenges that you face, you know, maybe you chose to have those difficulties, and that a more difficult life isn't worse necessarily than somebody who has no problems and has lots of money and everything else. In fact, that may be the reason we're here, is to learn from those things. Like when actors win an Oscar, they win them for the difficult roles. Like Tom Hanks won his first Oscar how? By playing the guy who had AIDS and who died, right? That's no fun. Nobody wants to have AIDS and die. That doesn't sound like a fun role, but yet at the same time, that is the role that was, you know, laid out for him. And I'm sure he grew as a person from playing that role. And that may be what's happening here. And how we treat other people is how we're going to measure our progress on the game afterwards. So that's my greatest hope for humanity, is that we start treating each other in that way by realizing that's why we're here, and don't blow each other up.
We got to get to that gnosis sort of process, right? Reach gnosis.
Yeah.
Be more aware of that. Thank you for that response. Thank you for this really cool conversation. I hope that we can expand on more stuff in the future. You're always welcome here. So thank you for your time.
Yeah.
What do you got going on that maybe you want people to be aware of in the coming future?
Well, so depending on when this airs, you know, I'm going to be at a conference in Florida with Deepak Chopra Sages and Scientists Conference in December. I'm going to be teaching a class on the simulation hypothesis online. They can go to my website, ZenEntrepreneur.com, which is based on my first book, which was called Zen Entrepreneurship, which was about my stories of trying to be an entrepreneur and trying to do all these other weird things on the side. But if they keep an eye there, I mean, I generally have classes online for people who want to interact with me. I just finished the book tour, so I'm not out doing as many book signings as I was this year because the book just came out this summer. But yeah, and then I'm writing a book that goes a lot deeper into the religious scripture side. And we talked about it at a high level here today, but we didn't get into like specific passages and stuff. So that's an area that I'm interested in as well. And
Oh,
you know, if people have life reviews or life preview stories, I'm always interested in hearing those. You know.
I can tell you all about mine though.
Yeah, I would love
I've
that.
had a wild experiences that I'm trying to understand still. So we can talk whenever.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'd love to do that.
All right. So Riz, thank you for your time, and I'll see you again soon. This goes out today though. I'm not waiting.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, I look forward to it. Great.
All right,
Thanks for
man.
having me
Thank you
on.
so
Yeah.
much. Yeah.
Okay.
And
Yep.
thank you, everyone. You know what to do. Like and subscribe and follow Riz everywhere. I'm going to leave every link he has in the description. Have a good one. Bye.